Iceland gets more rain than London. Moisture hangs in the air most of the year, and yet, for over a century, the national government planted millions of trees across the island, roughly 3 million seedlings a year at peak effort, and nearly all of them died. Not from drought, not from disease, from a mechanical process running underground that no amount of replanting could overcome. By the late 19th century, more than 40% of Iceland's land area had been classified as what one government researcher called a wet desert. The rain falls, the ground rejects it. Water hits the surface and runs off like it's striking a tin roof straight out to sea, entirely bypassing the soil beneath. There's no organic layer to catch it, no roots to drink it, no canopy to slow it down. How does a landscape that once supported birch woodland across a quarter of its surface reach a point where it can't keep a single seedling alive through winter? It starts with volcanic bedrock, runs through the freezing point of water, and ends with a process that turns the island's own rainfall into a machine for destroying anything planted in the ground. The fix, when it finally came, didn't start with planning. It started with a diagnosis that took 50 years of failure to reach. When Norse settlers arrived in 874 AD, the island they found looked nothing like the Iceland of postcards. Between 25 and 40% of the land mass was covered in native birch woodland, dense, low canopy forest stretching from the coastal lowlands into sheltered valleys and up the lower mountain slopes. Beneath the birch grew willow, rowan, and thick mats of moss that held the soil together like a living net. The settlers needed that wood. They needed it for longhouses, for boats, for fuel. And most critically, they needed it for charcoal. Smelting bog iron, the only way to forge tools and weapons in a place with no mineral deposits, demanded enormous quantities of it. Within 200 years of the first settlement, over 95% of the original forest had been cut down. But the felling alone didn't seal the island's fate. What sealed it was what the settlers brought with them: sheep. Hundreds of thousands of them, released to graze freely across the landscape from early summer through autumn. Iceland's growing season is brutally short. Native birch regenerates slowly. A sapling can take years to develop enough woody tissue to survive a single winter. The sheep ate every seedling that emerged. Every root sucker, every germinating seed browsed to the ground before it could take hold. By 1977, the sheep population had reached 896,000, outnumbering the human population by nearly 4 to 1. The forests lost the ability to replace themselves. By 1900, forest cover had collapsed to less than 1% of the total land area, and what lay beneath wasn't just bare ground. It was something far more dangerous. Icelandic soil is built from volcanic ash, light, porous, fertile when intact, but structurally held together almost entirely by roots. Without that living framework, the soil has the integrity of wet powder. Expose it to wind and it lifts. Expose it to rain and it washes. The 1,000-year root network that had kept the island's surface in place was gone. And without it, the soil started to move, not gradually, but in waves, driven by a geological force unique to this particular island. Iceland sits directly on the mid-Atlantic ridge, one of the most volcanically active boundaries on Earth. Eruptions are frequent, explosive, and they blanket the landscape in fine-grained volcanic ash. In a forested environment, that ash settles harmlessly into the canopy, gets pinned by roots and moss, and eventually breaks down into nutrients. On bare ground, volcanic ash becomes something else entirely. It becomes a weapon. In 1104, Mount Hekla erupted after at least 250 years of silence. The explosion ejected roughly 2.5 cubic kilometers of ash into the atmosphere, blanketing more than 55,000 square kilometers over half the island's surface. Settlements within 70 kilometers were buried outright. The agricultural valley of Þjórsárvöllur was abandoned and never resettled. But the eruption itself wasn't the worst of it. The worst was what came after. On bare, deforested ground, the ash had nothing to hold it: wind. Picked it up, accelerated it, and turned it into a perpetual sandblaster. Fine-grained, sharp-edged particles scouring whatever vegetation remained, shredding bark, stripping leaves, exposing fresh soil to the same wind that was already carrying the last batch away. Each storm created more bare ground. Each new patch of bare ground fed the next storm. The loop locked in and started accelerating. By the 1880s, migrating dunes of volcanic sand were swallowing farmland across the southern lowlands. In 1882, the cycle hit its catastrophic peak. A massive sandstorm struck the ancient farmstead of Gunnarsholt, a site farmed continuously since shortly after 900 AD. For nearly 2 weeks, gale force winds drove walls of volcanic grit across the land. Every blade of grass was stripped. Hundreds of sheep died where they stood, their wool so heavy with trapped sand they couldn't move. A nearby lake, deep, productive, full of trout, was filled in completely by the migrating dunes. When the storm finally stopped, farmers found fish lying dead on dry sand where the water had been. That disaster founded the Icelandic Soil Conservation Service in 1907, and it drove the government to begin planting trees in earnest. 3 million seedlings a year at peak, species selected by foresters trained in continental European methods. The seedlings would survive the brief summer, put out leaves, look promising. Then over winter, up to 30% of planted larch and pine simply died. No browsing marks, no disease, no obvious damage on the surface. Decade after decade, the same result. The cause was underground. The volcanic soil, stripped bare of its organic cover, holds enormous amounts of moisture. During winter, Iceland's maritime climate pushes air temperatures back and forth across the freezing mark not once, but dozens of times in a single season. Each time the temperature drops, the moisture in the upper soil freezes, but it doesn't freeze evenly. Unfrozen water deeper in the profile gets drawn upward toward the cold front, forming flat sheets of ice that expand vertically as more moisture feeds into them from below. A seedling planted in this ground gets caught. The frozen soil locks around its stem and upper roots. As the ice sheets grow and push the surface upward, the seedling moves with it. When the ground thaws and drops back, the seedling doesn't. Loose particles fall into the void beneath the roots, ratcheting the plant slightly higher. Over the course of a single winter, dozens of these cycles can extract an entire root system from the earth. The fine roots snap. The taproot loses contact with moisture. By spring, the seedling is sitting on the surface, roots in the air, dead. On bare wind-scoured ground, this destructive frost penetrated nearly 20 centimeters deep. Under intact birch canopy, it rarely exceeded 5. The same rain that should have been growing forests was instead fueling the mechanical process that destroyed them. The system wasn't merely broken, it was actively hostile. And every tree the government planted walked straight into the trap. For over a century, the approach never changed. Select species, plant seedlings, wait. When they died, plant more. But the seedlings weren't failing because they were the wrong trees for Iceland. They were failing because the ground they went into had lost every mechanism for holding a living root. Researchers finally turned the question around, not which tree could survive the Icelandic winter, but why the winter was so destructive in the first place. And every answer led back to the same variable, the absence of a biological layer between the atmosphere and the soil. The proof of concept came early. In 1905, the government fenced off a surviving scrap of native birch at Hallormstadur in eastern Iceland, nothing more than stunted, heavily browsed shrubs. The moment sheep were excluded, the birch began regenerating on its own, spreading rapidly uphill. The native woodland wasn't extinct. It had been held down season after season by hundreds of thousands of animals grazing freely across the island. But fencing alone couldn't solve the chemistry. On the worst eroded land, the soil was sterile mineral dust, no nitrogen, no organic matter, nothing for a root to grip. You needed a plant that could grow in nothing at all, fix its own nitrogen from the air, and build a living layer on top of dead rock. In Nýli, 1945, the director of the Forest Service, Håkon Bjarnason, spent 3 months in Alaska searching for species adapted to the same kind of climate Iceland had: cold, maritime, volatile. He came back with a suitcase of lupine seeds. The Nootka lupine turned out to be an almost perfect chemical scaffold. The plant partners with bacteria in its roots to pull nitrogen directly from the atmosphere and lock it into the soil. Fast-growing up to 60 centimeters tall, it produces enormous volumes of plant matter that die back each winter, depositing a thick, nitrogen-rich blanket onto the ground. Over a few growing seasons, dead volcanic gravel transforms into something a tree root can actually grip. But the lupine did something else that mattered just as much. Its dense canopy acted as an insulating layer over the soil, slowing the advance of frost and dampening the violent temperature swings that built those destructive ice sheets. The deep freeze that had been ratcheting seedling roots out of the earth for 50 years was weakened, not by armoring the seedling, but by changing the thermal behavior of the ground the seedling sat in. Now the trees could survive their first winter, and once they survived, genetics mattered. Bjarnason's expedition launched decades of provenance trials, dozens of seed sources from coastal and boreal forests across Alaska and Canada, that eventually identified a natural hybrid of Sitka and white spruce from a single bay in Alaska. It combined rapid vertical growth with extreme frost hardiness, and it handled every condition Iceland could throw at it. The method that finally worked was not a single fix, it was a sequence, and each step created the conditions the next one needed. Fencing came first, because nothing survives in open ground while sheep are grazing across it. Once the animals were excluded, native grasses could stabilize the bare surface enough for lupine to take hold. The lupine rebuilt the chemistry and insulated the soil, which let fast-growing pioneer conifers establish a microclimate beneath their branches, and only then, into ground that had been fenced, stabilized, chemically rebuilt, and thermally protected, did the long-term canopy species go in. The largest application of this sequence today is the Hekla Skogar project, 100,000 hectares of degraded land surrounding the same Mount Hekla, whose 1104 eruption triggered the worst of the cascade. The engineering logic is precise. When Hekla erupts again, ash that falls on bare ground becomes a sandblaster, but ash that falls onto a forest canopy gets pinned by branches and roots, decomposes, and feeds the soil instead. By 2024, over 5,000 hectares of foundational woodland were established, with natural regeneration already spreading visibly beyond the original planting clusters. But the lupine created a second problem. Free from its Alaskan predators and diseases, the plant spread far beyond the barren ground it was meant to repair. It invaded intact native heathlands, shading out small orchids, cushion plants, and dwarf willows that had evolved for nutrient-poor conditions. It is now officially classified as an invasive species. Satellite models show that over 13% of Iceland's land surface is currently suitable habitat for it, and that figure is projected to more than double by 2080. The tool that rebuilt the soil is now the single greatest biological threat to the ecosystems the soil was rebuilt for. The same compounding logic that spent 1,000 years pulling Iceland's surface apart is now running in the other direction. In 1995, the island's managed forests were drawing approximately 65,000 tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere per year. By 1999, that number had more than doubled to 127,000. The canopies were closing, the root systems were interlocking. The organic layer that had been blown into the ocean for centuries was building again. By 2022, annual sequestration had reached 505,000 tons, a 17-fold increase from the baseline set just 3 decades earlier. Managed forest is now the only land use category in Iceland that functions as a net carbon sink. Everything else, farmland, drained peatland, degraded heath, is still losing carbon to the atmosphere. In the autumn of 2022 at Kirkjubeyjarklaustur in the south, a Sitka spruce planted in 1949 was officially measured at 30.15 meters. The Prime Minister attended. It was the tallest tree recorded anywhere in Iceland since before the last ice age. And honestly, that number is less about the tree and more about what's underneath it, a soil system rebuilt from dust that held firm for 73 years. The trees brought company. Inside the closed canopies at Hallormstadur, the same site fenced off from sheep in 1905, now covering 740 hectares and hosting 85 tree species from over 600 locations worldwide. Bird species that require dense woodland for nesting have arrived from continental Europe and established breeding populations. Goldcrests, chaffinches, blackbirds, species that had no Icelandic name because they had never existed in recorded Icelandic history. The forest created the habitat drew the birds now disperse seeds and cycle nutrients, accelerating the very woodland that brought them in. The feedback loop is running forward. But the timeline is long. The sheep population has finally dropped below the human population, roughly 365,000, down from that peak of 896,000, driven by changing economics and shifting diets. Planting rates hold at 3 to 4 million seedlings a year, but reaching even 5% total forest cover will take another 150 years. The country stands at roughly 2% today, up from less than 1. The government's target is 12% by 2100, still less than half of what the settlers found when they arrived. Think about what that means. The island has been planting trees for longer than most countries have had electricity, and it still has less woodland than a mid-sized national park. But the trajectory underneath that number tells a different story. The soil holds water now. The ground stays where it is. Carbon moves from the atmosphere into the earth instead of the other direction. And the mechanism that made all of it possible was not a tree. It was the recognition that you cannot plant a forest on ground that has forgotten how to hold one. You rebuild the ground first. The trees come second. Iceland's wet desert wasn't beyond repair. It was trapped in a loop, and the loop had a specific point where it could be interrupted, not with better trees or bigger budgets, but by rebuilding the ground itself, one failure point at a time. If that kind of engineering interests you, subscribe. There's more to come.